Good morning, or good afternoon. This hearing will now come to order. As the hearing is fully virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If you notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate your approval by nodding, the staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there's a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of speaking order, we will follow the order set forth in House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member. Then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Okay, now we can begin. This afternoon, we'll be hearing from the 19th National Park Service Director, Mr. Charles F. Sams, about the fiscal year 2023 budget request for the National Park Service. He's accompanied by Jessica Boren, the National Park Service Comptroller. Director Sams, welcome. We are so pleased to have you before the subcommittee today. You've come to the Park Service at a critical time for the agency, which has been without a permanent director for 6 years. During that period, the service has faced some significant challenges, including record visitation to the parks, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the positive, but nonetheless challenging, ramp up of the construction program to implement the Great American Outdoors Act. I commend the career staff for their commitment and dedication to keep the agency on track. Our focus for today's hearing is the President's $3.6 billion request for the National Park Service, an increase of $346 million or 10.6% above the FY 2022 enacted level. Notable increases include $228 million for tackling climate change, conserving our natural resources, and using science to inform decision-making. $148 million to increase staff capacity throughout the parks, and $48 million for advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities. These are important investments that will better enable the National Park Service to understand and adapt to the significant challenges it faces in the 21st century so that it can meet its mission for future generations. Director Sams, I'm eager to hear about your vision for the National Park Service, to learn about what you believe are its most critical needs, and to gain a better understanding of how we in Congress can help support the National Park Service so that millions of people can continue to enjoy these majestic natural and cultural resources. I'd now like to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Joyce, for his opening remarks.
Thank you for yielding, Madam Chair. I'd like to welcome Director Sams and Park Services Comptroller Jessica Boren. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and congratulations on your historic nomination, Director Sams. As your first American Indian to lead the National Park Service, I have no doubt that your heritage, experience, and respect for our public lands will serve the country well, and you'll be a great steward of our national parks. As a son of a World War II veteran, I also want to thank you and your family for your service to our country. The FY23 budget request is $3.6 billion for the National Park Service, which is a 10% increase over the current year level. While I wholeheartedly support the parks and want to protect them for future generations, I worry that it'll be difficult to provide the service's full request given the country's current financial situation. With the national debt now over $30 trillion, we must take a careful look at federal spending to make responsible choices where we can. It's been several years since the National Park Service had a confirmed leader, so today provides us with a good opportunity to hear firsthand how the FY23 request makes investments to help Park Service carry out its mission. Last year, the national parks welcomed more than 297 million visitors, up nearly 60 million visitors from 2020. As visitation rebounds following the pandemic, it's important we provide the necessary resources to expand access to the parks, increase capacity and recreational opportunities, and improve visitor experiences. Deferred maintenance continues to be an ongoing issue for nearly all national parks, including those in my district like the Cuyahoga Valley National Park and the James A. Garfield National Historic Site. I look forward to discussing how the request, along with the funding provided through the Great American Outdoors Act, will address the service's extensive maintenance repair backlog to help us preserve the parks for future generations. Additionally, with the Ohio and Erie Canalway National Heritage Area in my backyard, I remain supportive of programs that provide technical and financial assistance to partners and groups that operate outside of the national park boundaries. These dollars go a long way to help local communities preserve their history, conserve natural resources, and spur economic growth. Director Sams, thank you again for joining us today. When your schedule allows, I invite you to come out and visit our parks in Northeast Ohio. It'd be a great opportunity to show you the impact the National Park Service sites have in our region and our state. Thank you again, Chair Pingree, for calling, support, and hearing today. I look forward to the discussion, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you to the ranking member for your statement. And Director Sams, we'd love to hear from you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today. Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you on the fiscal year 2023 budget request for the National Park Service. I would like to summarize my testimony and submit my entire statement for the record. I want to begin by thanking you for your support of the NPS for fiscal year 2022. Thanks to the additional funds you provided, all parks are preparing for the summer season with full fixed costs covered. And we are moving forward with important efforts such as ensuring all of our U.S. park police officers and law enforcement rangers have body-worn cameras. I would also like to thank Chair Pingree and Ranking Member Joyce for our recent visits. I appreciated the opportunity to hear your priorities and was so pleased that so many of our goals align for the future of our parks and our dedicated employees. I've visited parks across the country in recent months and seen firsthand some of the challenges facing our parks, like climate change, increased visitation, and a need to expand the breadth of the histories we are telling. I have also heard from our employees about challenges like housing, connectivity, and capacity. I'm pleased to share with you today how our fiscal year 2023 budget request addresses many of these issues. The discretionary budget request for the NPS is $3.6 billion, an increase of $345.6 million compared to fiscal year 22 enacted funding levels. Our budget request makes bold investments essential for the service's continued success in its second century by investing in our valuable resources, our employees. I want to highlight a few components with you that we are particularly proud to include in this year's budget request: conservation, racial justice, and restoring capacity. Our request proposes an additional $225 million in targeted service-wide investments to protect natural resources from 21st century threats. Fundamental to this effort is a $57 million increase for park capacity in our natural resource programs. We also propose additional funding to complete natural resource projects, transitioning the National Park Service fleet to zero-emission vehicles, complete climate vulnerability assessments, and better position the agency to respond to natural disasters. President Biden's Executive Order 13985, Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities, directs federal agencies to operate in an environment that advances equity for all. The fiscal year 23 NPS budget proposes $36 million in increased targeted investments to advance racial justice and equity for underserved communities. $14 million would fund new and critical responsibilities at parks, preserving the stories of underrepresented communities. This funding will support many of our newest units, such as the Medgar and Miley Evers Home National Monument, as well as existing units like Minidoka National Historic Site. The budget also reflects our commitment to respect and strengthen Indigenous connections and enhance our nation-to-nation relationships. We've requested an additional $6 million to support additional tribal liaisons in parks and regional offices, and an increase of $7 million in grant funding to tribal historic preservation offices. The fiscal year 23 request also proposes investments in our employees. The NPS has lost more than 15% of our own ONPS funded capacity since fiscal year 2010. Over the same period, 33 units have been added to the national park system, and visitation has grown by more than 40 million, or greater than 15%. We have already seen visitation levels rebound in many parks from the pandemic decreases. To meet this demand, the budget requests $148 million across initiatives to support more than 1,000 additional FTEs. The budget also proposes increases of $7 million to lease, construct, or rehabilitate housing for NPS employees. $7 million to improve connectivity for sites with limited bandwidth, and $600,000 to stand up an office that would provide targeted support for employee mental health and wellness. Finally, I'm pleased to update you on our progress to implement the Great American Outdoors Act. To date, funding from GOA has provided almost $2.6 billion to the NPS for deferred maintenance and repairs. We have obligated $730 million to date, with 26 projects underway and more starting this summer. From the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the NPS has received nearly $200 million for land acquisition activities, and we are working with willing sellers across the country to protect lands within park boundaries. The NPS has received $690 million for state grant programs, matched by non-federal funds for a total impact of more than $1 billion, and continues to work with state partners to support state and local recreation priorities. Madam Chair, this concludes my summary, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for your continued support of the National Park Service. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that and for taking on this extremely important job. It's going to be wonderful working with you. We're going to start with our questions, and I will start with myself. A topic that you've already mentioned, that's climate change. So in our park in the state of Maine, we're already feeling the impacts of climate change in Acadia National Park. The Gulf of Maine, which surrounds the park, is warming more rapidly than the oceans anywhere else in the world, and its temperature has risen 3 degrees over the last century. The park itself is also getting warmer, and your scientists predict that its temperatures will rise by 5 to 13 degrees by the end of the century. This warming will have major impacts on the park and local economy, and it's already starting to be felt. It's imperative that we take immediate action to fight climate change, and I believe that research should underpin those efforts. So I'm pleased that the budget requests $17 million for research learning centers and proposes to increase the inventory and monitoring program by $16 million. Could you just talk a little bit more about the National Park Service climate change research and how it's helped to identify what resources are at risk and how it's influencing management actions to help increase their resilience? And also, can you talk a little bit about how the service can communicate what you're learning about climate change to the millions of visitors who come through the parks?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The NPS has completed several assessments on this issue. 80 park-specific reports, 100 climate change vulnerability assessments for selected resources, and sea level rise projections for 118 coastal park units. However, many of the parks lack targeted climate change vulnerability and risk information. I want to thank the committee for the $1.8 million for fiscal year 22 spending bill for climate change assessment. We apply climate science research across our mission. A couple good examples, of course, is from Acadia, where the park works with the Scotic Institute and Friends of Acadia to understand how climate change will affect its forest, mountaintops, and intertidal areas. The park is using this information as it restores wetlands, ensuring the plant species that are planted are suitable for Acadia's climate future. As our knowledge base grows, visitors are becoming better educated in the entire ecosystem of coastal Maine and the fragile balance between the flora, fauna, and the rising sea levels. And we want to continue to make sure that we do that public education so that it goes far and wide, not only to Mainers, but of course across the country, is a great example of how we can work on resiliency. The fiscal year 23 budget proposals historic investments in addressing the effects of climate change and other conservation issues in the national park system, with a $224.6 million increase proposed for these conservation efforts. The NPS has completed several of these assessments as discussed, and we're ready to move forward on more of those in fiscal year 23 if our budget is approved.
Great, thank you. I do, of course, hope we get a chance to welcome you to Acadia National Park and to see the great work they are doing with the Scotic Institute, really to help us sort out how the park is going to fare and also surrounding areas in our state. And I'm pleased that the park uses these opportunities for what they've learned as a teaching tool. I think climate change is so confusing and abstract to people. Sometimes when you're visiting the park and you get a chance to talk to a ranger about your real questions of what's happening, or an interpretive worker, it's a really wonderful moment in time. I'm going to yield back and turn it over to Ranking Member Joyce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Sams, now that the Land and Water Conservation Fund is fully funded, spending the annual appropriation efficiently and on quality projects will be key to the program's continued success. In that context, I want to raise a concern about the appraisal process, and particularly about appraisal delays that may be posing a threat to the success of the LWCF projects we fund in our bill. I understand the department's appraisal office isn't under your control, but we're hearing from your partners on Battlefield and other projects. Specifically, we're hearing that an appraisal process that used to take a few months, as it does in the private market, now takes a year or two or even longer. Granted, no one wants the appraisal office to cut corners or otherwise detract from the integrity of the process. We need good appraisals to protect public funds and honor the rights of the landowners to just fair compensation when they choose to sell. But with these kind of delays, landowners and others, including partners who bring non-federal dollars that leverage and stretch your conservation reach, could give up and walk away. Are you aware of the problem? And if so, what can you share with us about steps being taken to fix it? For example, does it make sense to move appraisal functions back under the Park Service?
Well, thank you, Representative Joyce. I'm very familiar with this, having come from the private sector before this and working with the Trust for Public Land. I know the challenges that are faced when trying to get appraisals done as quickly as possible through the process. Of course, the National Park Service is reliant, and because appraisals are handled by the Department of Interior's Appraisal and Valuation Service Office, we will continue to work with DOI, ensuring its services are completed in a timely manner. I know that it's a top priority of our staff. And I know that this problem is being investigated and looked at the highest levels. And I hope to come back and be able to report to you soon exactly how we're going to deal with that so that we can move these through and we don't miss the opportunities with these willing landowners who really wish to work with us. And I'm very appreciative of their willingness to work with us.
I am too, sir. Thank you. For the first time in several years, the National Park Service released deferred maintenance estimates. The updated estimates total $21.8 billion, nearly double the Park Service's 2019 estimate. I recognize that construction costs have gone up, but can you take a moment to explain the spike in estimates and how your assessment process has changed and what types of deferred maintenance were not previously accounted for and how we can actually be sure that the Great American Outdoors Act funding is making progress to tackle the backlog?
Absolutely. Thank you. DOI recently standardized the deferred maintenance and repairs definition across all of our bureaus. As part of that standardization, the Park Service added project execution costs for planning, design, and construction management into the DM and R calculations. While these costs increase the total, they do better represent the funding necessary to bring assets into acceptable conditions. And as you pointed out, our now estimate did jump to 21.8 billion. And yes, there are also those associated costs, as you pointed out, with rising inflation. But this new standardization that we use, which is much more consistent with other federal agencies, captures the full cost of this deferred maintenance, which wasn't caught previously. And we feel secure in this current estimates of what we have moving forward as we gather more data from the field on those deferred maintenance issues.
So is the annual maintenance funding request for fiscal year 23 enough to prevent adding to the deferred maintenance backlog? And if not, how much more is really needed for annual maintenance?
You know, that will just depend as we continue to evaluate each of one of our sites. Maintenance will always be an ongoing issue. Things deteriorate or break down depending on weather conditions, usage, and current update of maintenance practices. And so as we're trying to build this out, of course, even in one of our requests is bringing on additional staff that would help with that maintenance upkeep and check. By being able to have those staff in the field, we think we can better tackle this situation and do preventative maintenance. But of course, maintenance will always be there as long as we construct things within the park system itself. And those costs will continue to go as things start to deteriorate and fall apart.
Thank you, sir. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. We are going to go to Representative Lee.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Commissioner, and thanks for all of your hard work with the Park Service. I personally am a big user of the National Park Service, so I appreciate everything you do. I wanted to talk about something that I have been consistently talking about since I've been in Congress, which is the drought that is engulfing the Southwest and obviously Nevada, my home state. It's the worst drought that this region has seen in 12 centuries. And honestly, too many children in my district have not lived a life without it. And so last April, the administration launched the Interagency Drought Relief Working Group And it was co-chaired by the Departments of Interior and Agriculture to address the needs of communities like mine who are suffering from the drought. I wanted to ask you, what role has the Park Service specifically played in fulfilling the working group's mission?
Well, thank you, Madam Representative. And yes, this has been a major topic among myself and the other bureau heads here in the department as we're figuring out how best to tackle this issue. National Park Service is an active member of the working group and coordinating across those federal agencies as we work with our partners to also include state, local, and tribal governments. Between the Great American Outdoors Act funding and the fiscal year 22 disaster supplemental, the NPS has prioritized more than $45 million for drought-related projects at Lake Mead Natural Resource Area, National Recreation Area, and Glen Canyon's National Recreation Area. Projects include relocating the Calville Bay water intake barge at Lake Mead and repairing a well at Wahheap due to low water at Glen Canyon. The fiscal year 23 budget also requests an additional $7 million for emergency and unscheduled construction projects specifically meant to rapidly respond to the impacts of climate change, such as drought, fire, and floods. And so, yes, we are working very closely. I know that my fellow bureau heads and I have had a lot of discussion around the drought issue, including looking at plans for ourselves to go out together to start addressing more of these concerns.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit more about the Lake Mead National Recreation Area, which is in my district and provides recreation for not just recreation, but obviously water for 5 million people in Nevada and neighboring states. Lake Mead is also the first and largest national recreation area, and the declining water levels have completely reshaped the lake's shorelines and significantly reduced recreational opportunities. In fact, it was just announced this week that there is only one working boat launch ramp in the lake with a completed extension. And so in addition, most of the launch ramps at Glen Canyon's National Recreation Area have likewise been closed. So what you mentioned dollar amounts, but what specific steps do you foresee in the next year and beyond to help mitigate the impacts of this drought? And, does the Park Service plan new access points? What specifically is in that plan?
We're talking with our leadership out west about different access points, what that's going to look like, how that's going to affect our concessionaires and the general public. And we're laying out mitigation proposals that are coming in from the recreation areas to tell us exactly what the public is saying and how we can ensure that there's still access to this great jewel that we have out west. So as we're laying out those plans, I look forward to coming back and speaking with you directly about this, and I can talk with your staff as we come to some conclusions on that.
Thank you. I very much looking forward to working with you on this issue, and obviously the impact of climate change on drought and its impact on our national parks. With that, Madam Speaker or Madam Chair, I'll yield.
Thank you for your question. Representative Simpson, you're next.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and Director Sams, thank you for being here today. You're lucky in that I think there is really good bipartisan support and has been for the National Park Service in this committee over the years. And I'm sure that will continue because we all love our national parks. In fact, the reality is we love them too much. And that creates the challenges that we have in the maintenance and so forth. But let me ask just a couple of specific questions. One is, in this budget request, you've requested, and I think you mentioned it in your opening testimony, $7 million, an increase of $7 million for grants for tribal historic preservation offices. What is that $7 million on top of? What's the total request for historic preservation offices for tribal historic preservation offices?
If you would allow me, I'm going to defer to Jessica on this for the total amount.
The total amount requested for the Historic Preservation Fund is $151.8 million.
Okay. That includes the $7 million increase, right?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, to me, that's a very important program. And we need to make sure that it gets funded at an adequate level to be able to carry out their responsibilities and stuff, as I'm sure you know, you're well aware. Talk to me a little bit about your personnel, the challenges you're facing. Every federal agency I talk to, whether it's the Forest Service or the BLM or any others, are facing shortages in personnel, which are, you know, delaying the time it takes to get permitting and that type of stuff. With the National Park Service, you mentioned this somewhat in your opening statement. What is the challenges we're facing with personnel?
You know, it really is about capacity and ensuring that we have enough people to do all the jobs necessary. And so in my request, we're requesting nearly 1,100 FTEs to help us try to get back to where we were at least a decade ago. And that is across all points of the service, whether that is from our science staff to the back end finance staff to our permitting staff. Right now, folks are pulling double, triple duty. As I've been able to travel across the United States over the last 4 months, in particular, I've hit almost nearly 40 national parks. This comes up repeatedly that our workforce is highly dedicated to the mission. I would say that most folks within the Park Service truly bleed gray and green. That being said, you know, they are doing double duty on so many of their things. And so we're asking this funding so that we can make sure that we're able to implement the programs we're doing, that we're ensuring that the investments that are being made through GOA and Bill are being effective, and that we're being responsive to the American people so that they can have the experience that they're looking for when they're going into the parks. And as you know, there are so many more things that happen on the back end. And while the rangers who do the interpretation and law enforcement are always on the forefront, they're supported by several to 8 other people in order to make sure that a person has a seamless opportunity to enjoy the nature, the monuments, and the memorials across this great nation. And so this request that I have out here is to help fill that backlog of folks that we need to get out on the ground to support that work.
What about summer employment that helps the rangers and stuff that are out working in the national parks, people that, you know, that's their kind of summer jobs, especially senior citizens sometimes come to our national parks and spend their summer there working at various places. Is that a challenge?
It can be a challenge if we're hiring them on a seasonal staff, as we're getting through ensuring that we have enough human resources personnel to start processing that. We're looking at it, and I've taken a very strong look at this and re-centralizing some of our HR practices so that we can have a much more smoother opportunity for folks coming in through that process to be hired. But I do want to give notice to the 240,000 plus volunteers that we have who are our force multiplier in the National Park Service. Without those volunteers, we wouldn't be able to get a lot of what we do done. And they're an important factor who provide everything from interpretation to help in keeping up the grounds themselves. And so, you know, bringing in, though, a dedicated workforce, either through the summer months as seasonal employees or permanent employees, is critical for our success.
Well, I appreciate it. And I appreciate all you're doing. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be off from Congress here. So me and my wife and my dog are going to take a road trip and go up through, as you know, we live in Idaho Falls. We're going to go up through Grand Teton and Yellowstone and see him for a while. I haven't been there for a little bit, so look forward to seeing him again. And thank you for all you do.
Thank you. Safe travels.
You bet.
Are you yielding back, Mr. Simpson? Yes, you are. All right, thank you. And sounds like a great trip. You'll just have to bring us all along. Representative McCollum, do you have a question or some questions?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much, Chair Pingree. This is like a good hearing today because we're going to learn what we can do to help our parks. But it's also filled a great opportunity, I think, to showcase the work that we need to do in this committee. I want to focus on the Park Service commitment to racial justice and equity and how we can embrace that by expanding our outreach to underserved communities. So whether we're talking about urban youth, disabled Americans, people of color, or whether that there are Americans who have just historically faced barriers in accessing and enjoying our public lands. So I've been working with this subcommittee and the Forest Committee, Forest Service over the last few budget cycles to expand a successful Urban Connections program, which addresses the equity gap and accessibility by forging relationships with urban youth, leaders, and organizations to create recreation and learning opportunities in our national forests, our wilderness areas. So I would like to get a checkup on how the National Park Service is doing. And I heard what you were saying about personnel shortages, and you fully have my sympathy on that. And I'm ready to do whatever I can to help with the chair to increase the people that we have to work on this. But, right now, I know you're still working on it, and in spite of not having the full complement of staff that you would like. Just fill us in a little bit about what you're doing to connect marginalized communities to the outdoors, especially in urban parks. And I have two of them in the river parks, the St. Croix National Recreation Area in my district. And then we have the Mississippi, the St. Croix is a scenic river. The Mississippi River is the river that has a recreation area assigned to it. So that I read a while ago, and I keep in my office, is Last Child in the Woods, and you could say Last Child in the Prairie, Last Child on the Coast, whatever. And it's about how we need to connect children to nature. And I know that the Park Service has been doing a lot on that. So could you just tell me some things that we need to do more to overcome barriers with that, especially for historically marginalized communities? It's different when a child drives on a bridge over the river versus being on a canoe or walking along the shores of a river and the connection that they have to it. So public-private partnerships, what do we need to do to help you do more?
Well, thank you, Madam Representative. I feel very fortunate that I grew up outdoors most of my life with a grandfather who made sure that my education began by understanding my natural environment. That being said, one of my top priorities is to advance equity, inclusion, and access in carrying out the National Park Service mission. The fiscal year 2023 request includes $36 million to advance racial justice and equity. This includes $2.4 million for underserved community outreach coordinators in urban national parks to build strategic community relationships and increase engagement with historically excluded communities. This is critical for us to be able to understand those local histories much better and to make sure that we're including them in the stories we tell, whether that's at the memorial site, a monument, or in the national park itself. In addition, we also included $5 million to identify and address transportation barriers that inhibit underserved communities from accessing parks, and $5 million to expand our accessibility expertise across the country to ensure we are meeting our physical and programmatic accessibility requirements. And you were seeing some of that here in the nation's capital, especially around the FDR Memorial. That being said, as I travel across the country, I do see several marginalized communities who are finally feeling that they have a seat at the table with not only just within their community, but with us as a federal organization to be able to tell their story in a much more broader concept. And whether we do that, as you may see the Chinese American community at Yosemite, or the Native community in a number of parks where Native people have lived here for 10,000 plus years. We are reaching out to a much more diverse group of people and helping us tell those stories so that it's much more inclusive, because one of my goals is to ensure that every American sees themselves in our park system. It's ensuring that it builds us a much more perfect union and an understanding of who we are as Americans and these crown jewels that we have that we love so much, and how they're going to protect them, not just for themselves, but also for future generations.
Well, we thank you for that. I know Mr. Simpson and I've been on at Acadia with the chair. Some of our parks weren't designed for ADA. They weren't designed for strollers. They weren't designed for families. And so that's something that I know you're working on as well as personnel. And so we've got some great partnerships out there, nonprofits like Urban Connections and that. And anything that we can do to grow that, I'm happy to do that. And at the same time, tell an inclusive story. And I mean that as a social studies teacher. Thank you so much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chair McCollum, for your questions. Chair Capter, you're next. Do you have any questions?
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. Very much an interesting hearing. And thank you so much, Director Sams. Great to have you here with us today. I keep thinking, as I'm looking at David Joyce on the screen, I keep thinking of two of our predecessors, Ralph Regula and John Cyberling, who Republican and Democrat together worked to allow us to have the assets we have today along Lake Erie. And in fact, across the nation, they were completely dedicated to the National Park Service and to the assets of the Department of Interior. So thank you for being in the service. My question really goes to our region first, and the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area, which is one of the 10 most visited park systems in the country. With the funding we've provided in other bills, as well as your annual budget, here's my problem. The Cuyahoga River was the western boundary of the United States when we had the 13 colonies. When you try to traverse the Northwest Territory, which started at the Cuyahoga River and then goes west to several states in the middle part of the country, there really isn't any common interpretive mode that occurs. So for example, I represent one of the smallest national parks in the country at the Perry Victory Memorial, Victory and Peace Memorial. It's 25 acres. Woohoo! We're really glad that little place gets 200,000 visitors a year. 200,000. Okay, nearby are something not in your control called the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we have been working since my very first year in office to expand the number of holdings from about 3,000 acres. We're now close to 12,000 acres along Lake Erie's southern rim, which is extremely fragile and serves as a wetland filter to a very troubled lake, which we must not let die. And I start looking a little bit west of that, and we have something called the Fallen Timbers Battlefield, which has a relationship with the National Park Service and the Fort Miamis National Historic Site and the Fort Meigs State Memorial, because one of the biggest battles, the Battle of Fallen Timbers, occurred there in that Northwest Territory. There is no common interpretation across this region. So what I'm asking for is anybody in your operation there able to work with us in our region, the former Northwest Territory, to begin to interpret America's first frontier in a more coherent manner. We have all these little dibs and dabs. This goes up into Michigan to the dunes there, over into Indiana, to the Northwest Territory. We so need this. And I'm not quite sure how to get it. One time I had a former National Parks director in my district, great guy, one of your predecessors. I said, "What can you do?" And he answered me, "Well, in our building in Washington, I'm on the same floor as the Park Service." So I've never been able to get the two instrumentalities to work together. Our Fish and Wildlife Service area probably gets, just right now in the spring, we'll get 100,000 visitors because that's where the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways cross. We got trumpeter swans that didn't go south this year. Man, they are magnificent. And, but between the Victory Memorial and the British, American, and French heritage, that's all tied up there, and the wildlife refuges, we probably get, oh my, 500,000 to 1 million visitors a year. I'd have to total it all up. That's the thing, we don't even know. So how do we get this? Do I have to pass a special piece of legislation? Do you have some authority to help us with coherent planning? What can we do?
Well, Madam Representative, thank you for the question. So on my non-Indian side, we came in through New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and eventually my 8th great grandfather, Henry Sams, had fought in the Revolutionary War and then homesteaded in the Northwest Territories and eventually landing in Richland County. And so the story that you are wanting to tell is also very important to me on a very personal level. My wife's family comes from Cuyahoga and has had one of the inn holdings there and was just on Boston Mills Road growing up. That being said, I want to make sure that we do remain committed to collaborating with state, county, and cities and other federal agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on management and interpret opportunities across the service and in the state of Ohio. Perry's Victory and International Peace Memorial collaborates with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, in a ranger exchange with NPS rangers participating in the biggest week of birding and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Rangers participating in the Perry Education Days. The NPS Rivers and Trails Conservation Assistance Program has facilitated connectivity among agencies, cities, and counties and states through 3 years of work on the Ohio River Recreation Trail. The trail connects communities and promotes recreation on 270 miles of the Ohio River through Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. And a summit of elected officials. That was the Ohio Rivers Recreation Trail.
Thank you.
And a summit of elected officials was held on May 12th, hosted by the mayors of Cincinnati and Louisville to discuss the benefits of the Ohio River Recreation Trail. The National Park Service hosted a very similar summit last October in 2021. In addition, we also, NPS's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom also connects themes across the states. Last year, it provided $180,000 in grant funding for network sites, including the Beecher Family Home, which is a state-owned asset in Cincinnati, and the John Brown House, which is a locally owned asset in Akron. The UGRR expects to award over $100,000 in funding for the most recent grant round, and it just extended its grant application to June 19th of 2022. NPS will continue to work within DOI's Great Lakes region and its bureaus, our park partners, and the state of Ohio in developing a good forum for discussing further ways that we can collaborate on these important projects and to tell a much more coherent and strong story about America's expansion in the Northwest Territory.
Thank you.
Director, I think you go ahead. I'm just saying, I think you're out of time, but it sounds like your Ohio is in very good hands with our National Park Service Director.
It sure does. Finally, somebody who knows where we are.
Okay, Representative Kilmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for being with us today. I want to congratulate you on your appointment and just recognize the significance of it. It's also great to have a park director from the Northwest. So congratulations to you. Rather than treading territory that's already been tread, I just want to associate myself with Ranking Member Joyce's questions about deferred maintenance and some of the concerns there. But I want to ask about two topics with the time I have. One, as you know, during World War II, thousands of Japanese Americans across our country were forced from their homes after Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order authorizing the exclusion of Japanese Americans from military areas. This was a really dark chapter in our history, especially relevant to the Pacific Northwest and the folks I represent. On Bainbridge Island in my district, 227 Japanese Americans were forced to leave, forced to board a ferry at Eagledale to begin the journey that would put them in internment camps for the duration of the war. There is a memorial there managed in part by the National Park Service that's located at that former ferry dock. And it's a site that remembers and honors those that were forced from their homes. And the memorial reminds us to learn from the past. It is extraordinary. I invite you there. And it's powerful, and it reminds us of a time when Japanese Americans were denied their civil liberties and their constitutional rights. My question for you is, how does the National Park Service intend to strengthen its work of preserving and interpreting sites where Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II, and how can the committee support that important work?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. You know, the president signed Amachi into our system now, and we'll be working very closely to be able to also tell that story. But it's important we tell all the stories of those parks that we have and those facilities that are under our jurisdiction. And for fiscal year 23 budgets, we proposes $198,000 for interpretation services at the Japanese American Exclusion Memorial for Bainbridge Island, because we want to make sure we tell that story very clearly. You know, it's important that we do tell this particular story so that we don't repeat our past, and understanding that with pain that we caused our fellow Americans in that, and also be able to tell and celebrate the accomplishments that they made when they did serve during the Second World War, whether that was during the Italian campaign in the European theater, or those who went and were interpreters for us during in the Pacific. And so we have taken a very strong approach to this. As you know, the Biden administration came out with a strong proclamation, and we continue to bring in those stories. And we're very fortunate to have some that are still alive who sadly had to live in those camps, but they're able to tell their stories firsthand still.
I had an opportunity to meet with some of those families, and again, would love to. They've got amazing plans for what they'd like to do in terms of interpretation and visitor experience. And I'm sure if you were ever so inclined to come out and visit Olympic National Park and visit the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial, they'd love to share their plans. Let me, with the time I have left, I wanted to ask. There's a lot of coastal tribes, including many in my district, that are facing urgent threats from climate change, tsunami risk, persistent flooding, coastal erosion. All of these are unfortunately existential threats. The Ho tribe, for example, lives in a remote and difficult to access area near the Pacific coast, surrounded by the Olympic National Park. The majority of the tribe's developed land, including many homes, is located in a tsunami inundation zone. And unfortunately, there's only one road in and out of the reservation. It is frequently impassable during storms. In the event of a tsunami, the only option for evacuation is an uphill walking path that is inaccessible to tribal elders and others with mobility issues, and it's difficult to maintain given wilderness restrictions on heavy equipment. The tribe has an urgent need for an evacuation route that would help allow passage of a small vehicle to transport elders and others while continuing to protect the ecological value of that land. While conversations have started at a local level to establish a vehicular evacuation route, how can the National Park Service engage with the Ho tribe and frankly other at-risk tribes to develop emergency plans in the face of potential natural disaster?
Yes, many of the coastal tribes will face these issues, and as we see climate change and sea level rising. That being said, I'm aware that the Ho tribe has proposed to construct a 2-mile-long trail that would accommodate some off-road vehicles that would come through the park. The park continues to assess the proposal, and we're gathering more information, and we have discussed informally with the tribe what that may look like in preparation for such more formal consultation. The administration, while it hasn't taken an official position, is going to rely on that information that we bring back in from the tribes, and so that we can assess that better and come up with a plan. I look forward to working with you and your staff as we come to a much more conclusion, because I know that you're very keenly aware that the Ho tribe wants to move this as quickly as possible, and most likely will deal with some form of legislative action that we'll need in order to accommodate.
We'll look forward to partnering with you, and thank you, Madam Chair, for a few seconds of indulgence. I yield back.
Absolutely. I know how important that topic is in your district. I think we have time for a couple more questions, so I'll go back to one of mine. I'm going to use Acadia National Park again as an example, but I know the issue of employee housing is serious all over the country and one that you really have to tackle. In Acadia, we welcomed 4 million visitors last year, which was nearly 3 times our state's population. The competition for homes, lodging has created a great strain on housing in the area, which makes it difficult to attract and retain staff. The budget requests $2 million to support seasonal housing for National Park Service employees around our national parks. Can you tell me how you envision addressing housing concerns and how we'll use that requested funding to improve housing shortages like we have in Maine? And as an aside, $2 million doesn't sound like a lot to deal with the crisis that we have out there.
Affordable housing is becoming increasingly difficult, and it's been made very clear to me by the staff as I've traveled around the country. And it's difficult for them to find in gateway communities, and especially for our seasonal employees. Median home purchase prices continue to rise throughout the United States, and many of our gateway communities in short-term vacation rental markets are thriving, and therefore taking away from our seasonal work staff who usually would be able to find a housing in our gateway communities. The fiscal year 23 budget proposes an increase of $4.9 million for new construction or rehabilitation of existing employee housing where local market data show limited availability of affordable housing for purchase or rent. In fiscal year 2023, these funds would largely support construction of new units at the Grand Teton National Park. Between Grand Teton and Yellowstone and Yosemite, we're really looking at best management practices on sustainable housing and housing that will meet the needs of staff at multiple levels, whether those be seasonal or permanent staff for growing families. We're going to try to we've most recently held a housing summit among the staff to bring forward the best ideas to determine what authorities we do have or what authorities we may be needing in the future. I look forward to reporting out more on that and trying to get a better understanding of what the total cost may be in the end. But this initial funding will help us greatly to be able to tackle these immediate issues, along with being able the other $2 million to help us be able to get leases for our seasonal staff so that they will have somewhere to live during this season, next season.
Well, thank you for making this a priority, and we'll look forward to following up with you as you've gotten a better sense with how you're going to move forward on some of those challenges. The ranking member, do you have questions?
No, I'll defer any of my questions in writing so the director has the opportunity to address them, and defer to our other fellow members so they can ask questions accordingly. Thank you.
sorry. So we are now in a second round of questions, and I'm not exactly sure who wants to ask, but I will start. Chair McCollum, do you have any questions you'd like to ask? Chair Capter, would you like to ask a second question?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I wanted to go back to the director and ask if one wanted to work with the Department of Interior as a result of the infrastructure bill, as well as your current responsibilities, because we face the lakefront up in northern Ohio. What would be the framework we could use to bring together stakeholders, the metro parks, the state parks, the wildlife refuges, the National Park Service, to look at a lakefront interpretation? I'm not going to exclude the state of Michigan, but if you want to, that's okay with me. But I'm trying to get a bigger picture of how we work together with common interpretation. It was interesting what you revealed about the immigration story of our region. Frankly, I think the most magnificent place in America to even describe it isn't part of the Park Service, but it's part of Cleveland's heritage with the cultural gardens. It is just magnificent along Martin Luther King Drive in Cleveland. There's no, even the United Nations doesn't have it. Nobody in the world knows about it except the people that live in Cleveland. I keep telling them, you've got a world asset here, showcase it a little bit more. So what experience could you offer? We have Native American interpretation, that's a part of the settlement of the Northwest Territory. There's immigration, there's battles. I mean, how do we put the pieces of the historical puzzle together? What examples do you have around the country?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that as we've done summits in the past, if we concentrated on a summit to bring all of those multiple stakeholders and partners together to have a more robust discussion along shoreline issues and the history of that, I think is extremely important. While I was out in your territory, both in Ohio and in Detroit, Michigan, we talked about along the Detroit River itself, and then of course the lakefront. What are all of those stories that we still need to tell that have not been heard? Whether that was from folks coming on the Underground Railroad to first contact between Native people and non-Native people, French traders who have used those systems between Canada and the United States, and what that meant for the building of commerce for the United States. I think those are all important stories that we need to be able to tell in a much more comprehensive manner. And similar to our previous discussion, I think we could be part of a convening group to bring a summit together to have that discussion. I will need to talk to the regional director about this a little bit more in depth, along with my operational staff, to see how we could do that. But I would welcome that opportunity, along with our sister bureaus who have interest in the area, and of course the states and local communities and counties, in figuring out how best to hold a summit that would have this longer discussion.
I would really welcome your thoughts on that, and I have a hunch Congressman Joyce might be equally interested. We have Native American interpretation. I learned that I represent a place called Catawba Island. And when I didn't know till I went and looked at a chart at the Native American Museum in Washington that it was a disappeared tribe. And I traced the history of why that name ended up there, even though the tribe is in North Carolina. I still don't understand it all. But you look at our names: Erie, Ottawa, Cuyahoga, Maumee. These are all Native American names through our area. There's nothing said about that. So, I mean, we have a lot of historical gaps here, and I think we need to fill them. So I'm just pleased with your openness, and I'll talk to Congressman Joyce. Maybe we can work together somehow here, figure out how to do that. I think it'd be exciting, and I think we're going to miss an opportunity if we don't do this right with the infrastructure bill. Because we got communities along the coast trying to interconnect, and trying to get the Cuyahoga group, Cuyahoga Valley Recreation Area, to go up to the lake and interconnect that way. So there's a lot of things happening, but nobody's working all together. So that your leadership could really be, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, by the way, together, could really be important from, I think, a standpoint for our region. We could use your help.
Well, thank you. I also would invite the Department of Transportation, both the federal department and the state's departments of transportation.
Oh,
The highway systems are the trails that were originally used for commerce by tribes for thousands of years. And so they have funding and opportunities to be able to do additional interpretation along those roadways.
all right. Well, thank you so very much. Thank you, Madam Chair and members.
Absolutely. Representative Simpson, do you have a second question you'd like to ask?
Thank you, Chairwoman. Not really a question, just a statement. Following up on what the Chairwoman's question was about housing in our national parks and stuff. The money you have requested is probably not going to go very far. The way housing prices are going and the fact that construction prices are following that, I'm afraid we're not going to get much done for that request. And what I'd like to see, and I'm sure you guys have got it somewhere, is like a 5 or a 10-year plan of what the needs are to address this so that we could address this backlog of housing for our employees in our national park, so that we would know as a committee, what do we need to commit year after year after year to meet that goal to get it done. And so if somehow you could put that together for us so that we would have some view into the future of what this is going to be, because this is going to be a challenge for a long, long time till we address that need. So that's just my suggestion, but I appreciate you being here today. And I look forward, and this committee looks forward to working with you to try to improve the national parks that we all love. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think any other members have questions. Let me just double check here. Nope. So I just want to thank you very much for the time you spent with us today. Mostly, we want to take this time to just thank you for taking on this job. There are a lot of challenges, as we know, in the national park system, but also it's a very exciting time with opportunities for everything from the Great American Outdoors Act to the real upsurge in interest of people who want to be in their national parks and participate. And I can tell that you're going to handle these challenges well, and we're all here to support you. So thank you for taking the time today. And we'll look forward to catching up with you soon in the future.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. It's been a pleasure.
Great. This hearing is now adjourned.